Hello, my friend. Come, sit closer to the fire. It is a quiet night, and the stars above us are very bright. Have you ever looked up at the moon and wondered? Have you ever thought, how did we get there? Tonight, I want to tell you a story. It is not just a story about machines or math. It is a story about us. It is a story about the human heart and our hunger to do the impossible. We call it the space race. Imagine it as the year 1945. A very big and terrible war, World War II, has just ended. The world is tired. People want to rebuild their homes and their lives. But even though the guns are silent, a new kind of struggle is starting. We call this the Cold War. The Cold War was not a war with big battles. Instead, it was a competition between two powerful countries, the United States and the Soviet Union. They did not trust each other. They had different ideas about how the world should work. One was in the West, and one was in the East. They both wanted to show the world who was stronger and smarter. But while the leaders argued, something else was happening. Humans have always looked at the stars. For thousands of years, we told stories about the moon. We used the stars to find our way across the ocean. We dreamed of flying. Now, for the first time in history, we had the technology to actually try it. The two countries began to look at the sky. They realized that the next great frontier was not on Earth. It was above us. They started to build giant rockets. These rockets were originally made for war, but some people had a different vision. They saw a way to leave the Earth. Can you feel the tension in the air back then? Every scientist was working late. Every government was kept secret. The world was holding its breath. They were waiting for someone to take the first step into the great, dark ocean of space. The dream was old, but the race was brand new. It was a cold night in October 1957. Suddenly, the news broke. The Soviet Union had done something incredible. They had launched a small silver ball into space. Its name was Sputnik 1. Sputnik was not very big. It was about the size of a beach ball. It had 4 long antennas sticking out of it. It didn't do much. It simply circled the Earth and sent out a sound. Beep, beep, beep. But that simple sound changed everything. For the people in the United States, that beep was scary. They looked up at the sky and realized a Soviet machine was flying over their heads. They felt they were losing the race. If the Soviet Union could put a satellite in space, could they also put a bomb there? This fear moved the race into high gear. But Sputnik was also an inspiration. It was the first time a human-made object stayed in orbit. To orbit means to travel in a circle around a planet. Sputnik showed that the door to the stars was finally open. It was no longer a dream. It was real. The United States tried to catch up quickly, but their first attempts failed. Their rockets exploded on the launch pad. The Soviet Union was winning. They sent the first dog, Laika, into space soon after. The message was clear. The East was leading the way into the future. The echo of Sputnik was heard in every home, in every school, and in every government office. By 1961, the race was getting faster. The world was waiting for the next big step. A human being in space. On April 12th, A young Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a small capsule called Vostok 1. He was a man with a kind smile and a lot of courage. As the rocket ignited, he shouted, "Poyekhali!" That means, "Let's go," in Russian. He flew into the blackness. For 108 minutes, he was the only person in the universe who was not on Earth. He saw the blue curve of our planet and the deep black of the stars. When Gagarin returned, he was a hero to the whole world. He proved that humans could survive in space. But in America, there was a sense of urgency. They felt like they were standing still while the Soviet Union was running. A few weeks later, the U.S. sent Alan Shepard into space. It was a short trip, only 15 minutes, and he didn't go all the way around the Earth. But it was a start. The Americans were finally in the game. However, they knew they needed to do something much bigger. Can you imagine being Yuri or Alan? They were sitting on top of a giant tank of fuel, ready to go where no one had ever gone. They were brave, but they were also just men. Their first steps were small, but they moved all of humanity forward. The dark space between the stars was starting to feel a little less lonely. In May 1961, the young American president, John F. Kennedy, stood before his country. He made a very bold promise. He said that before the decade was over, the United States would land a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth. Think about that for a moment. In 1961, they barely knew how to get a man into space for 15 minutes. Now, the president was talking about the moon. The moon is 238,000 miles away. It was like saying you would climb Mount Everest before you even knew how to walk. People thought he was crazy. It was too expensive. It was too dangerous. It was impossible. But Kennedy said something very famous. He said, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." He believed that a hard goal would make the country better and smarter. To reach this goal, the United States created NASA. They started the Mercury program. These were the first 7 astronauts. They became like movie stars. Everyone watched their every move. They were the pioneers of a new age. The challenge was set. It was no longer just about orbiting the Earth. The prize was the moon. The Soviet Union heard the challenge too. They began their own secret plans to reach the lunar surface. The race was now a long-distance run, and the finish line was a glowing white rock in the night sky. Before you can run a marathon, you must learn how to walk. NASA knew they couldn't go to the moon immediately. They needed to practice. This was the goal of the Gemini program. In the Gemini missions, 2 astronauts flew together in one capsule. They had to learn 3 very important things. First, they had to learn how to stay in space for a long time. Could a human body survive for 2 weeks in a tiny tin can? Second, they had to learn how to spacewalk. This means leaving the ship and floating in the vacuum of space. Imagine being held only by a thin cord, looking down at the Earth moving below you. It was scary and exhausting work, but it was necessary. Third, and most importantly, they had to learn docking. This is when 2 spaceships find each other in space and connect together. It is like trying to hit a moving target while you are also moving at thousands of miles per hour. It requires perfect timing and very steady hands. During this time, the Soviet Union was also pushing forward. A man named Alexei Leonov performed the world's first spacewalk. He almost couldn't get back into his ship because his suit puffed up like a balloon. It was a time of great danger. Every mission was a lesson. We were like children learning to fly, falling down and getting back up again. Success is never a straight line. In January 1967, the space race faced a terrible tragedy. The first mission of the new moon program, Apollo 1, was preparing for a test on the ground. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were inside the capsule. Suddenly, a fire broke out inside the ship. Because of the way the door was designed, they couldn't get out in time. All 3 men died. The news shocked the world. The space race had been exciting, but now it felt very, very real. People were crying in the streets. There was a heavy silence over NASA. Should they stop? Was the moon worth the lives of these men? For a while, it looked like the dream might die. But the families of the astronauts and the engineers said no, we must continue. They decided to honor the fallen men by fixing the mistakes. They spent over a year redesigning the Apollo capsule. They made the door easier to open. They changed the materials so they wouldn't burn. They checked every wire and every bolt. The fire was a lesson in humility. It taught everyone that space is a place that does not forgive mistakes. The tragedy didn't stop the race, but it changed the mood. It was no longer just a game of who is first. It was a mission of survival and respect. The astronauts were no longer just pilots. They were symbols of human sacrifice. They died looking at the stars, and the world promised not to forget them. After the fire, the Apollo program began to fly again. Each mission went a little further. In December 1968, Apollo 8 did something that changed how we see ourselves. For the first time, 3 humans, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, left the Earth's orbit and traveled all the way to the moon. They didn't land, they just circled the moon 10 times. On Christmas Eve, they looked back at the Earth. They saw a tiny blue and white marble hanging in the blackness of space. It looked so small, so beautiful, and so fragile. Bill Anders took a photo called Earthrise. It is one of the most famous photos in history. It showed us that while we were fighting on Earth about borders and politics, we are all actually living on the same small boat in a very big ocean. The Apollo 8 mission gave the world hope. It showed that the Americans were finally close to the goal. The Soviet Union was struggling with their own giant rocket, the N-1, which kept exploding. The finish line was finally in sight. The excitement was growing every day. People were buying color televisions just to watch the next launch. Kids were playing with toy rockets in their backyards. The moon didn't seem like a distant god anymore. It seemed like a place we were about to visit. The world was ready for the giant leap. Finally, it was July 1969. The world stopped. An estimated 600 million people, 1/5 of the world's population at the time, sat in front of their televisions. On the launch pad sat Apollo 11, a massive Saturn V rocket as tall as a 36-story building. Inside were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The rocket roared to life with a sound so loud it shook the ground for miles. They traveled for 3 days through the dark. When they reached the moon, Michael Collins stayed in the command ship, circling alone. Neil and Buzz took a small landing craft called the Eagle down to the surface. The landing was very tense. They were running out of fuel. There were alarms going off in the cockpit. They were heading toward a field of big rocks. But Neil Armstrong took control. He flew the craft like a master pilot. Finally, the dust settled. Neil's voice came over the radio. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." A few hours later, Neil climbed down the ladder. He put his left foot on the gray, powdery dust of the moon. He said those famous words.
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
For a moment, there were no Americans, no Soviets, and no enemies. There were only humans. We had reached another world. Neil and Buzz walked on the moon for 2 hours. They planted a flag, but they also left a sign. It said, "We came in peace for all mankind." They proved that if we work together and dream big, we can do the impossible. The space race eventually slowed down. After Apollo 11, 5 more missions landed on the moon. Scientists brought back hundreds of pounds of rocks to study. But the space race was about so much more than just rocks. It changed our world forever. Because of the space race, we developed the technology for the computers and cell phones we use today. We got better weather satellites that save lives. We got medical tools that doctors use every day. But the biggest change was in our minds. The space race showed us that we are not limited by the ground beneath our feet. It showed us that human curiosity is a superpower. When we decided to go to the moon, we didn't know how to do it. We had to invent the how along the way. Today, we see countries working together on the International Space Station. Former enemies are now partners. We are looking toward Mars and beyond. The race part of the story is over, but the space part of the story is just beginning. My friend, the fire is getting low. As you go to sleep tonight, look up at the moon one last time. Remember that people just like you and me once looked at that light and said, "I want to go there." And they did. Never be afraid of impossible goals. The story of the space race tells us that the only real limits are the ones we put on ourselves. The stars are waiting for the next generation of dreamers. Perhaps one of them will be you.